So don't turn the TV off or leave. The elders, we wanted to make a statement so that y'all know the latest information. It says earlier this week, our Governor DeSantis ended all local emergency orders related to COVID-19, including mask ordinances. As an increasing number of people are vaccinated, particularly those at higher risk, the need to continue wearing masks is greatly diminished. While the lifting of the county mandate, all church services and adult Bible classes will be mask optional starting immediately. Mask requirements for our children's classes will continue to mirror the Leon County schools through the end of the school year ending June 11th. Teachers and kids are going to continue wearing masks out of safety through the end of their school year, June 11th. If you need a special allowance or have any problems with that, please talk to one of the elders. In our church services and adult classes, anyone who would prefer to wear a mask is encouraged to continue, particularly those who are still not fully vaccinated or at risk. We will continue to offer relaxed distance seating in the front of the auditorium, and we'll preserve the option of distance seating in the rear of the auditorium. So when you come in, the men who are seating us, just let them know, and they'll seat you in the right spot. If you choose not to wear a mask, we request that you please move forward in the auditorium, as this is a personal choice. We call upon everyone to be respectful of our brothers and sisters' decisions, regardless of wearing or not wearing a mask. We all love one another. We're all working towards the same goal. Finally, we want to encourage anyone who has a respiratory illness or symptoms to please participate in our services remotely. We will continue doing that. That is very good for those that are at home, those who are sick or shut in. So that will continue. Thank you. I better not walk off.
And yes, it is a giant conspiracy to get people to sit toward the front. All right. Welcome to our midweek Bible study. We are in chapter 23 of the book of Acts, and we are following along on Paul's journey as he has been told by the Holy Spirit, and as he has been warned by prophets. He is now in Jerusalem, and he is under arrest. And so now he is on his way ultimately to get to Rome. And we're going to see that move along. If you do not have one of the handouts for tonight, Steve just come back into the back of the auditorium back there with some additional copies. And so if you just kind of raise your hand, he'll find one for you. Just some good information, hopefully, to go along with us tonight. Now, as we have been monitoring every week, and noticing through this, there's just a cycle. There's good news, bad news kind of a thing. And so the good news is a time of peace and growth as we're doing. Sometimes it's mere peace, but it's usually a time when things are going well. There's also times when there are internal conflicts, internal threats. These are things that arise from within the church. You know, like we've said before, I'm really glad that doesn't happen anymore. There's also things that arise from outside of the church and press in. So the church has to exist in this kind of a world where sometimes things are going well, sometimes there's trouble from within, sometimes there's trouble from without, and we need to look at how they dealt with these things so that we can better understand how we should deal with these things. Because in the immortal words of Lynn Anderson, one of my dad's favorite singers growing up, I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. How many people remember that? Oh, wow, that's more than I thought. So, that was, in fact, a paraphrase of Jesus there. But we saw last week a time of peace when Paul was passing through and he met with the brethren in Phoenicia. We saw an internal threat come up when the prophecies were given to Paul. You're going to find change. You're going to be arrested. You're going to have trouble. And they tried to talk Paul out of going. Don't go to Jerusalem. You know, and the human side of people rears its way. well-intentioned people. But it was not the will of God. And it was during that point in time when Paul said, the will of God, the will of the Lord be done. He was going to go on no matter what came his way. Then he had an opportunity to meet with the leaders in Jerusalem once he arrived there. The meeting went well. Brethren, comparing notes with brethren. Paul telling everybody what God had done amongst the Gentiles in the Roman world there. And then there was the advice for Paul. Paul, we know it's going to be a little bit difficult. We want you to kind of pay the expenses of these men that are under a vow. We know that there's going to be some trouble stirred up over the Gentile question once again. And so we're trying to take precautions and meet these things here. And then finally, a group of Jews from Asia, more than likely from Ephesus, because we're told that they recognized a man named Trophimus who was from Ephesus. They arrived down in Jerusalem. They identified the Apostle Paul, and they said, this is that guy who's been stirring up trouble wherever he goes. And so there was that problem that was there. So we saw Paul fall into the hands of the Romans, who were trying to just stamp out any kind of trouble that was going on in Jerusalem during that time. It is the time of Pentecost, and anytime there was a feast in the area there, that was usually a time when trouble was going to crop up. Somebody was going to make trouble for the Romans, and they were always ready to hammer down on it and to put it down. So he falls into their hands. They think that he's a wanted revolutionary. They don't understand why all this trouble is kicked up, and they learn when he begins speaking in Greek, that he is not the Egyptian man that they were looking for. And so he begins a discussion with his Roman captors as they're about to take him into the fortress that adjoins the Hebrew temple. And he then turns and speaks in Hebrew to the people who are standing there. So all of that played itself out. And when they were about to kill Paul, the Romans seized him. They were going to beat him, and that was when he announced that he was in fact also a Roman citizen. And we see the beautiful work of God in choosing Paul, a man who was a Hebrew of Hebrews, but was also a Roman citizen. And Paul pulled rank on the commander of the Romans there. The commander boasted that he was a man of a lot of wealth and that he had purchased his citizenship. And what we found out from Paul was that he outranked him in that sense because he was born a citizen, and that was considered of more status that was there. So that's where we left it last week. And so the Romans are now in custody of the Apostle Paul, and he has the commander has told the council, the Sanhedrin, to assemble, and they would have their opportunity to bring charges against him. So if we look back in the last verse of chapter 22, it said, "And on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them." So he's bringing him down from that fortress, down from the barracks. In other words, downstairs. And he is going to bring them into the council room, the hall of hewn stones where the Sanhedrin met. This is a pretty good diagram that is drawn here representing this area. Technically, these men in blue here are in fact the council. But there were also chief priests and who are also referred to as rulers, but also some scribes who would be witnesses in this. And the accused, and then in turn each of the witnesses would stand in the middle of them. And if you remember that far back, back when John and Peter were first arrested, when they had healed a man who had been crippled from birth, it said that they set him in the center. And that's exactly what it looked like. You can imagine that would be just a touch intimidating. And it was probably meant to be that way. But in essence, this is the means of adjudicating things in Hebrew society. We have Separation of church and state? No, it was all one and the same under the law of Moses. The law dictated their civil life, and the law dictated their religious life. And if there was any kind of a transgression, it was adjudicated by this system of Hebrews in this court system. The Supreme Court, or the closest they would have to an equivalent, would have been the council or the great Sanhedrin. And it was a very interesting group. It was 7 scribes who are, in essence, legal scholars. They're lawyers. 7 priests who, among them was ultimately the high priest. He would have actually been an 8th priest. And 7 elders from among the community. So you have a good group of people that are acquainted with society, they're acquainted with their culture, they're acquainted with the law, and they were to be the judges of their brethren here. So the high priest would be presiding over all that. I gave you the handout, and the side that begins with Hebrew jurisprudence and the council, it was quite different than our system of government that was there. And there was, if you look under the section on the court, there was no public or state prosecuting attorney. There was no special or secret accusatory body like a grand jury. So the court could not originate the charges. In a very real sense, like we've seen happen with John and Peter, people would make charges against them and drag them before the Sanhedrin to see what happened. Here, Paul is being brought by who? The Romans, absolutely. So in that sense, they don't need standing to come before the court. They're just bringing a Hebrew man who is in their custody because he's a Roman to find out if there's anything that they can charge him with. You cannot ask the accused questions ahead of time. No preliminary interviews were allowed. No court could consist of a single judge. You would have to have the body in part or in whole that was there. No lawyers for the defendant. No lawyers for the accuser or the plaintiff. Legally and morally qualified judges acted as defense counsel and as judges. So there's a blending of their roles here. Certainty of indictments were required before the proceedings began. Judges were required to carefully consider the merits of the case. High priest could not uncover his head or tear his clothes. That's important. If you look on the other side, there's the various ways that the trial of Jesus was an illegal undertaking. It was an illegal court proceeding. And we also found that the trial of Stephen, if you remember that in the book of Acts in chapter 7, when he accused them of being stubborn, uncircumcised, stiff-necked people, the high priest tore his clothes. It was considered an outburst that would influence the other younger members of the Sanhedrin. And it was therefore considered to be an undue influence on them, because that was, in essence, announcing his verdict that would come there. So the youngest judge would vote first. Why would you do that? So he couldn't be influenced by the older guys. It makes perfect sense. It is a very fair system when it is carried out that way. Then each in ascending order, so that they would not be swayed by these older judges. A simultaneous verdict or a unanimous verdict had the effect of an acquittal. It was considered to be somehow skewed or unjust if everybody agreed on this. And certainly they wanted them to deliberate. What happened with Stephen? Ripped the clothes. Everybody stood up. They all said he should die. Dragged him out of town, threw rocks at him, and killed him. It was not how this was designed to go. We learned in the case of Jesus that it was a unanimous verdict against Jesus. All of them said that he was guilty. So it should have resulted in his acquittal. The court could not convene before the morning sacrifice or even after the evening sacrifice. Jesus was tried at night. They must convene in the hall of hewn stones in the temple, not in the house of the high priest, which was how Jesus was tried. Trials were public during daylight, not held on a day preceding a Sabbath or a holy day. Again, that was violated. No conviction of death sentence could be concluded in one day. Jesus's was concluded in one day. Stephen's was concluded in one day. So there was trouble there. The defendant had an absolute right to trial and a right to appeal up to the Great Sanhedrin. He was presumed to be innocent, and he was not placed under oath, nor was he required to testify. Did Jesus testify? No. Like a sheep before its shearers remains silent, Jesus uttered not a word. He was permitted to testify if he so chose. No uncorroborated confession could be used to convict defendants. How many people came before Jesus going, this man said that he was going to destroy the temple and build it back in 3 days. So they were using those things against him. The same uncorroborated information was used against Stephen as well. Witnesses are not under oath, but the witnesses act as prosecutors under this system of law. They give testimony separately, but in front of the accused. Again, it should have been a very fair system. Testimony witnesses required to agree in all essential details. Remember, against Jesus, they sought witnesses against him, but they could not agree with one another. But yet, the charges stood. False testimony made them subject to the crime charged against the defendant. I like that one. You make a false charge against somebody, you're guilty of that offense. That sounds fair. That would dissuade people. Accomplices could not give testimony, and a special committee held private examination of witnesses before allowing testimony. So that's what Paul was brought into. Here was the Great Sanhedrin. If you have that other side there, if you want to go ahead and read that on your own, that tells about the specifics of what happened to Jesus in his appearance before them. But the Sanhedrin was mentioned throughout the New Testament. Whether it was known as the Sanhedrin or the council, it's all one and the same. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking about basically cursing at people and calling people fool. He said, you will be subject to the council, which meant you would be brought under this system and taken and tried, and you would be liable to judgment by the Sanhedrin. In Mark chapter 15 and verse 43, we learn that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Great Sanhedrin. And he was the one who requested the body of Jesus. Kind of interesting there. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the Great Sanhedrin met and they were discussing Jesus. What are we going to do with this guy? And it was there in the Great Sanhedrin and that meeting discussing the resurrection of Lazarus where they said, the Romans will take our place away from us. We need to do whatever is necessary to appease the Romans and make sure we don't lose our status here as a Roman province. In Acts chapter 4, John, Peter, and the crippled man who had been healed all appeared there. And it was in that setting that we find that crippled man was placed in the center there. Another detail by Luke, Brother Luke, and the great historian that he was, just almost a side comment, but it is very, very accurate in how things were handled. The very next chapter, they bring Peter and John back in there, and it is in that time before the Sanhedrin that they said, should we obey God rather than men? And then we find out that in Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel was a member of the Great Sanhedrin. Who was a student of Gamaliel? Paul. Isn't that interesting? Because now Paul is going to be brought before this council and they know him. And more importantly, he knows them. And it's going to come to light here because Paul's not going to get to make a long and passionate plea before them. It's going to end before it really gets started. And it seems rather purposeful on Paul's part what he does there. So Saul was present when in chapter 6 and 7, Stephen was tried before the Sanhedrin, and they ultimately took him out and stoned him to death there in the streets as Saul held their cloaks. So he was in and around this group. He was a Pharisee, and he was trained in the law at the feet of Gamaliel. All right, so this trial is based upon the law of Moses. That's all they can do. This isn't about any other kind of civil law, because the law of Moses was their civil law. So if there's any transgression that Paul is guilty of, it would have to be a transgression of the law of Moses. And yet we're going to see that that's not exactly what it looks like. It all starts there in verse 1, Paul looking intently at the council. This is the third time in the book of Acts that we find Paul looking intently. Now, I don't know what this stare looked like, but it was noteworthy in Luke's mind. He had a gaze or something. This is when Paul meant serious business. We saw when he was trying to evangelize the proconsul of the island of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, the magician, the charlatan, was trying to dissuade Sergius Paulus from believing this guy. And Paul had some very stern words for him. But before he uttered the stern words for him, he looked at him intently. And so he gave him the look. In Acts 14, Paul was about to heal a man who had been crippled. And he looked at him intently. He made that eye contact to make sure the guy was looking indeed at him. And now he's looking intently at these men. Again, remember how intimidating that setting was. He got guys behind him, and he's got the Sanhedrin council right there in front of him, and he's there in the middle. You don't have to raise your hands, but in a setting like that, how many people would do this? Now, I would imagine a lot of other people would. But yet he's making eye contact, and he's sweeping the room, and he's just staring them down before he says this. He is very serious. He is not taking this lightly at all. All right. So here he is, and he says, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. You better be able to back that one up. But remember, these men know him. And they know what he was like before he went on that trip to Damascus. But now they're dragging him down here to answer charges that may end up in Paul's death. So this is serious business here. But this is exactly the kind of setting that Jesus foretold. He foretold it in a more general sense in Matthew chapter 10. He said, "Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." Who is addressing the Sanhedrin? God. God is addressing the Sanhedrin here. So why wouldn't Paul be bold? He's been told, you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound in chains. Okay, no surprise, he's in chains. He's been told that he's going to be dragged before governors. He's going to be dragged before kings. Before this chapter is over, he's going to be dragged before the provincial governor Felix. So this is all what Paul has been expecting here. But we also know that Jesus foretold this specifically for Paul. Because when he was blinded there on the road to Damascus, and when he was taken in to the house of Ananias, he was there to meet with him. Ananias didn't want to go talk to him. And we know who this guy is. So he has a conversation with the Lord, which is helpful when you get that kind of clarity from God. But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." Has Paul had an easy life as a Christian? Nope. Had Paul made people's lives difficult as Christians before? Absolutely. And Jesus knows. He's not trying to punish him. But all these things are necessary for Paul to carry out his ministry, because he's ultimately going to spend a couple of years in the household of Nero Caesar. That's an amazing accomplishment by God. How do you get a Hebrew man from Tarsus of Cilicia into the household and preaching to the Praetorian Guard and into the household of Nero, one of the most evil dictators in all of human history, and a persecutor of the church? How do you accomplish that? God can accomplish that. But again, notice, Paul had every reason to believe that he was going to be dragged before people. So he starts out, God speaks through him. Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. Well, that's an interesting statement to make. But he makes a more interesting statement. If you drop down to verse 6, he says at the end of that, I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. I'm not on trial for my life, even though his life may be ended. I'm not on trial because of what I've done or not done. I am on trial because Jesus was raised from the dead. I am on trial because I proclaim the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And he knows full well what this penalty just might be. But who's standing there on Paul's side other than God? Romans. Don't forget that, because you now have these Roman guards that have brought him into this chamber. And so they're protecting him also. So in many ways, the Sanhedrin's on trial. And so God is orchestrating all of this that is here. So Paul makes this address here. He makes that first statement that is very defensible. Paul has said that to the church. He writes about himself a lot. Y'all know how I lived my life. You know that I was an up-and-comer in the Hebrew world. I was ahead of many of my peers in the Hebrew world. I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I was on my way up. As to zeal, nobody could match me. As to persecuting the church, nobody could match me. And every single one of these members of this council knew that to be true. This was not just some random dude drawn in off the streets. They all knew that. It was a defensible statement, but watch what happens in verse 2. The high priest Ananias, not the one in Damascus, commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Under their system of jurisprudence, you just can't do that. Now, what would the Romans, do you think they would do? It's kind of like, they're getting ready here because they're responsible for Paul. He's their prisoner. And yet now we have the high priest, after making a statement like that. Is that blasphemy? No. Is it demonstrably false? No. It's a matter of opinion. If they have witnesses that can come in and contradict that, okay, bring in your witnesses. And let's see if they can agree on any charges against Paul. But so to this point, there have been no charges made against him. So here he sits, and Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. That's kind of milquetoast, isn't it? No, Paul comes out swinging. More importantly, the Holy Spirit comes out swinging. Again, Paul can't judge the hearts of those men, but God can. God knows who those men are. And that whitewashed wall, it reminds us of the whitewashed sepulchres that Jesus talked about, that outside adornment with an inner decay or inner problems that are there. And he says, do you sit and try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? Paraphrase, just who do you think you are? Well, the answer to that question is the high priest. You can't talk to the high priest that way. That's equally as wrong as striking the accused. Now, it kind of plays itself out, and Paul pleads ignorance here, but Notice what Paul is saying there. You're going to try me by the law while you're violating the law. Fair argument right there. But one that only a trained man and trained in the ways of his counsel could answer just like that. You know, again, it was to his benefit that he had that experience there. But you cannot commit a wrong in order to combat a wrong. And yet that's what Paul apparently did not do. The bystander said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So he quotes the law back to him. Again, he knew this. He was trained in this. He's building common ground, but as one who is highly trained there. And so now we know that Paul is on good, firm standing with these men. He's not messing around. God's not messing around. They have nothing on him. His objective was never to get to the council. His objective is to get to Caesar. The objective of God is never to bring Paul up on charges before the council. It's to get Paul to Rome. And that's what's being done. So this is just a way station along the way there. All right, knowing how the council functions and knowing that there was a theological split on the council between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed there was a resurrection, or going to be. The Sadducees did not believe there was a resurrection. They were very secular. They believed that this world is all there is. If you are in God's favor, you will be blessed financially in this life. If not, you will be impoverished in this life. It was kind of the argument that the friends of Job were having with Job. All this calamity has come upon you because you have sinned. And so the Sadducees were of that same mindset. And so Paul pounces on this. But watch all what is said during this. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees said there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." Suppose a spirit has spoken to him. Now, I don't think that they really knew, but it was an insightful statement. It was an insightful statement that was absolutely, positively true, because the Spirit had spoken to him and had told him these things and had taught him these things. He had received the revelation directly from Jesus, the resurrected Lord. The Holy Spirit is in constant conversation with the Apostle Paul and is in fact speaking through him at this very time. So you've got this uproar that Paul has now caused, that the words of Paul have caused, because he knew that theological statement there would cause this dissension. So the Pharisees are jumping to it. You can tell these guys have probably had this discussion before. And now he just, throws a match on a pile of gunpowder. And it flares up again. So he has accomplished something that he wanted to accomplish. God has accomplished something that God wanted him to accomplish. So here's the Romans again. Remember that they are there. Paul is their prisoner. And so Paul gets pulled out of here. In verse 10, as a great dissension was developing, the commander, the one we were introduced to in chapter 22, was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down, take him away from them by force, and bring him into the barracks. So notice, from where he is, back up in the Fortress Antonia, there are troops that he's in communication with in the council, and he's sending orders back and forth, and they grab him, and they go to take him away from there. So this guy is very cognizant of what these men are capable of, and he's fearing for the life of this Roman citizen that is under his charge. And then on the night in verse 11 following, the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." A time of peace. Paul doesn't know what's going to happen to him ultimately, and Jesus comes to him at that moment. He just calms things down and says, "You did well here. You're going to do well in Rome also." This is all part of the plan. Paul's doing exactly what God expects during this time. All right, so now we find something that is very, very providential. Another plot is going to arise. Beginning in verse 12, it says, "When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul." Now, they felt released from that because we know at least 2 more years are going to pass before he makes it to Rome. Another 2 years pass in Rome, and Paul's still alive there. So these poor guys are going to go 4 years without eating, or else they release themselves from this vow. There were more than 40 men who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, and as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we for our part are ready to slay him before he comes near the palace." They're going to attack Paul when he is under a Roman guard. That's bold. That's more than likely suicidal, but yet they are more than willing to do that. Verse 16, "But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush." The providence of God is amazing. We don't know the exact details of that. It says he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him. "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." They listened to Paul. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately. Kind of interesting. "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." All right, so Paul's nephew saves the day. To the rescue. Again, the providential work of God. And this commander, who was going to have Paul beaten, he owes him one. Paul has him over a barrel. And he's being very, very careful to make sure that nothing happens to Paul. So all of this is fallen into place here. So in verse 23, it says he called to him 2 of the centurions. How many men does a centurion lead? 100 men. All right, so we're talking about the commanders of 200 men. Says, "Get 200 soldiers ready." Oh, that's kind of interesting. "By the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." And the Apostle Paul. That's a pretty impressive force. What were they afraid of?
Ambush.
There have been rebellions and revolts in Judea before, for hundreds of years. This wouldn't be the first one, and it wasn't going to be the last one. But they were going to be prepared. And again, it was a festival time. It was Passover time. And so that just seemed to heighten the tensions there. He was going to make sure no matter what, he was going to get Paul out of Jerusalem. And he was going to be okay. 470 troops. And Paul was chained to one of them. That's how they were carting him around here. So they take him to Caesarea. Now, just for clarification, this is not Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is just north of this lake right here, about right there. We read about it in the Gospels a good bit, but it is a different Caesarea. This is Caesarea Maritima, which means Caesarea on the sea. Hadrian, the guy that built the wall up in Scotland, would later build an impressive artificial harbor here that would be the envy of the Mediterranean in another 60, 70 years from now. So it was a city that was on the up and coming, but there Herod the Great had built this city. And in 6 AD, when Judea became a Roman province, they moved the capital out of Jerusalem and moved it up there to Caesarea. And that's where the governor lived. That's where Pontius Pilate actually lived. He had another home, another residence there in Jerusalem. And he would go back and forth, but he ruled as the provincial governor from Caesarea by the sea, Caesarea Maritima. So that's where this was. And we learned there that he is going to send him to the governor, Governor Felix. I don't know about y'all, that name has always intrigued me because I remember cartoons Felix the Cat. The only person I ever knew named Felix was Felix the Cat and Felix the Governor. Anyway, strange things. I'm sorry. Probably should have kept that thought to myself, shouldn't I? So anyway, Felix is there. So we're going to have him go. He's going to send 470 Roman military personnel with him, take him to the governor that was there, and they're going to deliver a letter to him. So this is all very formal, but in reality, the commander's just kicking the can. He is taking Paul. He is getting him out of Jerusalem. He is getting him out of his jurisdiction. He's getting him out of his hands, and he's giving him to the governor. And let the governor take care of this mess, because this is going to get out of hand in a hurry if they stay there in Jerusalem. There's going to be a massacre, and this guy doesn't want that on his watch either. Now, interesting little side note, we learned the name of this commander. We've been talking about him, and he's been referred to as the commander, the commander, the commander. Well, we learned that his name is Claudius Lysias. And so we have this letter, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. It's kind of interesting, Luke, when Luke is writing the Gospel of Luke, writes to the most excellent Theophilus. When he writes the book of Acts, he writes to the most excellent Theophilus. Now, we don't know whether that was a title that he was due out of reverential respect, like a governor here, or whether he was just, showing reverence and respect for a man that he revered. But that was the form that the Romans would use in writing when you had a commander writing to a governor here. So his excellence would be I guess the way we would say it now. Most excellence, Governor Felix, greetings. Now watch kind of what he says here, because verse 27 is modified. It is not exactly the way things happen. If you were here last week, or if you remember the lesson, he was ready to have Paul beaten. And then he found out he was a Roman citizen. Watch how he puts it. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him. Kinda, not. And I brought him down to their, having learned he was a Roman. All right, so he learned he was Roman after the fact, but anyway, close enough. I wanted to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him. I brought him down to their council. That's what we read about earlier. I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Why wasn't he concerned about the law of Moses? Because he's a Roman, and the Jews were allowed to conduct business as they saw fit. As long as they deferred to the emperor, they could have whatever religion they wanted to have. And so as long as they behaved, Caesar would allow them to follow their own law. And so it was a means of assimilating cultures into the Roman Empire, and the Jews were recipients of it just like every other conquered people would be. And so it was of no matter to him if he failed to properly offer sacrifice. It was of no matter to him if he had any kind of transgression of the Hebrew law. And it certainly wasn't something deserving death. And if you remember the trial of Jesus, they said, we are not allowed to put someone to death. We have to hand him over to the Romans. So since it wasn't a capital offense, and it wasn't something that concerned him, he didn't really care. It didn't deserve imprisonment, so it wasn't a big deal. Verse 30. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. Now, at the moment he wrote this, he hadn't told the council anything. But I guess technically, by the time the letter got there, it would have been true. We'll cut him a little bit of slack on that one. But in essence, here's the deal. Put up or shut up, council, because I'm taking him up here and taking him to the governor. The governor's now going to conduct the trial. No longer the Sanhedrin. But if you've got charges, you bring him into the Roman court. And then you tell us what you've got against him. Now, interestingly enough, we learn in chapter 24, they go. And they want to press charges against him. They want Paul put to death. They don't want to mess around with him anymore. All right, so it says that the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now, this is another good point by Brother Luke. So they leave Jerusalem. They travel almost halfway. They spend the night here. Now, we learned something else about this time, because the group is going to go back up here to Caesarea. But notice what happens here. It says the next day, so they march out at night. They probably arrived a day later, spent the next night, and then the day after that, they go the rest of the way. The next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they return to the barracks. So they got him out of Jerusalem. The horsemen are going to go on with him, but the 200 spearmen, back to Jerusalem. Why? There's a festival. The 200 soldiers, back to Jerusalem. Why? There's a festival. There may be more trouble there. And so they need the troops in town to keep the peace. And so now Paul is in the company of 70 Roman horsemen. We learned earlier that they provided Paul a mount, so Paul's mounted also. And so he's in chains, chained to another soldier, on mounts. Everybody is now proceeding on the way up to Caesarea. When they had come to Caesarea, verse 33, and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. So they're carrying out their orders the whole way. They fulfilled their duty. Their job was to give the prisoner to the governor and to give the letter to the governor, to let him know what was going on. So he goes and makes small talk, verse 34. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was. And when he heard that he was from Cilicia, he said, I'll give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also. So he's just chit-chatting. You're a citizen? You're a Roman? Great. Where are you from? Very human stuff. We would do kind of the same thing here. But the charges are going to be pressed in a Roman setting. Everything's now passing. Now, for those of you that know the rest of the story here, what does a Roman citizen who is going through the judicial system at any step in the process, what does he have the ability to say? Magic words that can send him to Rome. I appeal to Caesar. He will do this, but he's waiting his time. But as soon as he utters those words, they have no choice. They take him to Rome. And that is why Paul, again, was so beautifully chosen that is there. He's going to keep him in Herod's praetorium in the meantime. Chapter 24 says, after 5 days, the high priest and some of his people arrive with an attorney, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. So they spent their time, they spent 2 or 3 days traveling, but they got up there and they were ready to press charges against Paul. All right, now, I want us to think about something again. I said 200 here. 70 horsemen arrived with Paul, and Paul's on that horseback. When you're sitting there in Caesarea, and you see all these Romans on horseback come riding in, and a civilian in the middle of them, would that get your attention a little bit? And this civilian who's there, he's bound in chains. It's kind of impressive, isn't it? Makes you wonder. We kind of gawk, rubbernecking. You want to see what's going on? Just our human curiosity. Well, this was a big deal when this entourage comes rolling into town. Go back to chapter 21. And in verse 8, it says, "On the next day we left and came to Caesarea, and entering the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, we stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses. And we were staying there for some days. A prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. And coming to us, he took Paul's belt, bound him by his own feet and hands, and says, 'This is what the Holy Spirit says. In this way, the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles.' When we had heard this, we as well as the local residents began begging him not to go to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, 'What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but even to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus.' And since he would not be persuaded, we all fell silent, remarking, 'The will of the Lord be done.'" Now, imagine being Philip. Imagine being one of his daughters. Imagine being one of the members of the church there in Caesarea. All of these local people who were begging Paul not to go. And they heard Agabus say, "I'm going to take this belt from Paul. I'm going to wrap it around his hands." And the Holy Spirit says, the one whose belt is wrapped around it, that's the way that he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. And Paul comes riding into Caesarea on horseback, in chains, as a prisoner of the Gentiles. Just a few days later. Isn't that amazing what God was doing? What do you think what kind of an impact do you think that would have on the church in Caesarea? What would they be thinking?
God did exactly what he said.
God did exactly what he said he was going to do. Do you think anybody was going, "Hey, we need to get together and let's attack the Romans and let's try to set them free"? No. God did exactly what he said he was going to do. And what did Paul say? When we tried to talk him out of this, what did Paul say? "The will of the Lord be done." What kind of a lesson would that have, would that teach the brethren? When they're hearing prophets speak, when they're seeing these things unfold, what does that teach them about trusting God? God is faithful, absolutely. I heard something over this way. That it's a good idea. I think God is faithful is probably a little bit more biblical there. But isn't it amazing when we see things like that and read things like that? Should we be any less impressed? Paul didn't come riding into Tallahassee. But should this strike us at our core to listen to what God says? Because God accomplishes what God says he's going to accomplish. This should instruct our faith just as surely as it instructed their faith. This should bolster our faith just as surely as it bolstered their faith. We need to just not casually pass by these things. Sure, this is a book in the Bible. Yeah, it happened a long time ago. Yeah, that's just an historical narrative about those guys. But man, 2,000 years has passed. Doesn't matter. God is still faithful. And God will bring to pass the things that God has said He will bring to pass. When we wonder what God is going to do, all we need to do is allow ourselves to be reminded what God has already done. We look back, and that's the beauty of the Scriptures. That's the beauty of these stories that we read. That by faith, people acted on what God said. And we are under that same charge. If our faith is in God, then we should believe what He has said and what He has promised. You know, things like God is not slow in fulfilling His promise. He was pretty quick on this one. Just a few days passed. And all of a sudden, here comes Paul in chains in the hands of the Gentiles. That's instant satisfaction right there. But 2,000 years? And yet, what did Peter say about those 2,000 years? What's going to happen in the outer years? Mockers are going to come. Then, where's God? Why is He so slow? Why do you people still believe those fables that Jesus is alive or that Jesus is coming back? We look at instances like this one. It is designed and recorded not only to instruct us, but to encourage us and to bolster and strengthen our faith in these moments. This is an amazing sequence of events that has transpired over the last little bit in Paul's life. He's gone a long way from that time when he said that he was going to make his way to Jerusalem and then to Rome. But that's what God said, I want you to do. And he went. He was not dissuaded by well-meaning, well-intentioned Christians who said, don't go. He still went. And at the end of all of this, those beautiful words, turn to 2 Timothy. This is recorded and written after Paul is released from the imprisonment at the end of chapter 28. He's going to live another 2 or 3 years after the book of Acts ends there. And so he knows the will of the Lord, okay? But at the end of 2 Timothy, there in chapter 4, he knows that his life is almost over. God has told him everything that's going to happen to him. Whatever he believes and whatever he understands, this is still a man of tremendous faith. So he's writing to Timothy, I solemnly charge you in the presence of God in Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. But wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. That is a beautiful statement of faith there. He knows the end is near. I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. The drink offering by the priests signified the end of sacrifice. It means things were done. Paul kept on giving. Paul kept on sacrificing. He kept on following the lead of Christ Jesus. But now he was being poured out as a drink offering. His time of sacrifice was over. He also doesn't say, the time of my death has come. He says the time of my departure. He knew that he was simply passing into eternity. What great comfort is there? And that everything that he had gone through, fighting the good fight, finishing the race, keeping the faith, he knew that there was laid up for him a crown of righteousness. He's still got a ways to go. at this point in the book of Acts. There's still a lot of hardship that is going to come to this man. But every step of the way, he is simply following the lead of God. And every step of the way, Christ Jesus is walking by his side. And so it is a providential journey that Paul is undertaking here. This is a man of tremendous faith. Let's not take the words of this historical narrative and let it just kind of pass in one ear and out the other. Let us take it to heart and let this strengthen our faith. Appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate your listening to us again tonight. We are done for the week. And we are